So to start off with, I think it's important to provide context. Who are we? Who's involved? Who's in the zoo? So really important to know that LANDFIRE is an interagency effort chartered by WFLC in 2004 and, supported by the Office of Wildland Fire and the Department of Interior with the DOI bureaus and agencies, and then, of course, the Forest Service with U.S. Department of Agriculture. Another key partner is the Nature Conservancy. A lot of times people are like, whoa, who's that TNC group? We think they're LANDFIRE. Well, it's because we've got such great communications with Megan and Jim Smith, Randy Swatty and company. And so sometimes you see the face of TNC and you're like, yeah, that's those guys. But it's important to understand that background. And of course, we are comprehensive at mapping, geospatial data, across the entire United States and territories. So another key aspect of this that I want to just highlight before we get into some of the nuances with the letter L today is this is not just about fire. These data support a lot of work in the land side of the house. So it's important to think about land and fire. Many people just focus on fire. That's one of my big soapbox items. So that's why you'll always probably see that in some of my presentations. So for those of you that have seen that before, I apologize, but important to remember that. So let's go to kind of the key of what Frank and I are going to talk about here today. The goal is, of course, to move towards an annual product suite. That's what we want to accomplish. And of course, the purpose of that is to increase the frequency of our releases, reduce the latency of the products, delivered in a time frame that, is supported for field use. And we're doing a number of things to help support that. There's, of course, a lot of work that goes into these details. But first and foremost, as you see there under the 2019 L part of this, steps that helped us move strategically to be able to position ourselves to accomplish this includes we moved the submission date from March to November. So those of you that have been providing data, back to Megan's poll question, we do rely heavily and significantly on U4 data, and we'll get more into those details here in a moment. But that is a really important part of this, is that date switch. And we'll talk more about the context of that. And then this is, another part of the letter L today, limited, is this is a step towards that goal of achieving an annualized product. So we're not going to be able to get there in one fell swoop. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more to that. I think with that, I'm going to stop. Frank, anything you want to add to this point, and then we'll get into some other slides.
No, that's good.
Okay. All right. So I really like this slide because it speaks to what LANDFIRE has been able to accomplish. It's one thing to create a map. It's another thing to update it and then maintain it over time. And so as you can see here, there's a number of products that have been completed. As we look specifically, though, however, at this LANDFIRE 2019 L, it's coming out here in 2021. So we're still, if you think about it, behind the power curve relative to users and the applications, of the data to have something more current in real time. So the things that we're going to share today will help explain what does this 2019 limited product mean to you. It is surprising, though, when you think about it, that we are just in the process of completing the LANDFIRE 2016 remap. And here we are rolling out also a 2019 update. And the reason for that is if you look at the calendar, if we would have just said, well, let's just focus on the 2016 product, users would still have an older, maybe the best way to say this, an older data set that they would be working with, roughly 4 or 5 years old, depending upon where you're at. So it's important for us to be thinking about and moving towards what we can do to provide updates. And that's what this 2019 limited product does. The key part that I'm focusing on here with the red arrow and the question mark is this point about how can we turn data around within a 1-year time frame. And so that's a really big question that the program is grappling with to try to figure out how can we do that and do that for all lands. So with that, anything else you want to add to this, Frank?
Yeah,
And
you'll hear more about this when Inga speaks, but we feel pretty confident we can turn around submitted data pretty quickly. It's the remote sensing data. So if you really, really want to make sure that your information gets into the next version, submit the data.
Yep. Gosh, that was simple. End of story, right? Okay. Let's go to this next slide then, showing the importance. So disturbance is really what it's all about, change. As much as human beings sometimes say, hey, I don't like change, change is what we deal with. So I love this slide because it shows, how is LANDFIRE being updated? And of course, we're really chasing changes all the way from fire, silviculture, weather, insect and disease type disturbances and changes. And of course, this is just a graphic. It's from a few years ago, but just showing the disturbances and the distribution of some of those disturbances across, United States, Alaska, Hawaii. And then if we drill down, gosh, this iconic, when I think about LANDFIRE starting, this image, basically kind of what we're seeing here with Zoom, Hollywood Squares of Mesa Verde National Park, where we see what happened in that landscape, with the numbers of fires over a short period of time. Significantly change that landscape. And then of course other processes that help us include the burned area reflectance, monitoring trends in burn severity, all of those things contribute to what LANDFIRE produces. So to give you just another quick example of that change, here's an example of a fire in California in 2016. You see the pre-fire landscape from 2014. Then the fire occurred, of course, in 2016, and then with the update that, or the remap that occurred with our 2016 effort, you can see the updated data there. And of course, Inga will go into a lot more of those details about the specifics on this. So tying back to that poll question that we started out with, disturbance data is important to LANDFIRE, and good to see that you guys all recognize and know that. We often talk in LANDFIRE about the production of the assembly line. And when you think about the time that we're asking to say, please get your data in by November, and then turn the crank on that production and assembly line and deliver a product by June, that's only 6 months, which is pretty incredible when you think about sometimes what we do in the government. So it is a very, very lofty goal, but we're with this 2019 limited, as we'll get into more of the details with Inga, you'll see that we have been able to, as Frank mentioned, be able to turn that relative to submitted disturbances. And we think that's well within reach. Remote sensing is going to be a little bit more difficult. But in order for us to make this work, we need your help to get that data submitted, by that time frame. And even with that, I will say that, depending upon the volume, because all years are not equal. Let's take 2020, for instance, within the wildland fire, program. Large number of fires occurred in 2020. So when you start to think about the volume of data that needs to, be processed, that needs to be factored into, what we need to do to update these data. So as I mentioned, grappling with that question, can we, turn things around within a 1-year time frame, particularly with that remote sensing piece? That is the question. We're spending quite a bit of time, working on that to see what we might be able to do. And I'm not going to say that we're going to fully answer that question here with you today. That is a work in progress, but we at least get some insight into some of the things that we're looking at to, help us and ultimately help you with updated products, answer that question. So with that, I think I'll pause there, Frank. Anything you want to add? Okay. Key thing with this, just remember with, as I mentioned, the letter of the day, the letter L, 2019 limited. This is only focused on the conterminous United States. Unfortunately, because LANDFIRE 2016 remap was the base that was needed for us to generate this update, Alaska, Hawaii, and the insular areas were not in a position of completeness that we would be able to use that to feed into this. So unfortunately for our good friends in these areas, we just don't have that for the 2019 L. I will say that we are looking at that from a LANDFIRE program and figuring out what we'll be able to do to help bring Alaska, Hawaii, in Puerto Rico back up into the queue in an earlier sense and get you some updated products sooner rather than later. But more to come on that. I won't go into a lot of the details there. So with that, again, just to head us on a path to wrap up this segment here of an introduction. LANDFIRE has produced a lot of data relative to this 2019 L. We're excited to be able to share that with you today and get into some of the specifics here with Inga and take any questions that you might have, particularly as we look at how do we grapple with this question of remote sensing data, and then of course the importance of your submitted data. And with that, to the last slide. And anything else you want to add, Frank, before we turn to Inga?
Yeah, just to reinforce all the things I wanted to say have already been said. But today's webinar has been brought to you by the letter L. The 2019 L is an interim product that's moving towards our goal of increasing the frequency and reducing the latency. And because of that, the data that you submit is even more important than it used to be in the past. If you really want to make sure that your disturbance gets into the next version, submit it. Don't wait for us to find it remotely. That goes for disturbances that maybe you didn't even create. If there's a wildfire or an insect and disease patch that you think is important to see in the future version, and you want, when you do your modeling in your unit, you want to be able to see that, submit it too. You can figure out a way to put that in. And I know in the Forest Service, we can add things like that into facts, and then it gets scooped up when we do our facts extract. I'm sure there's ways for other users to get those disturbances as well. With that, I think we're handing it over to Ingrid.
All right, thank you.
All right, so I can go ahead and share now.
While you're transitioning, Inga, Henry, I just asked, you're asking for people to submit their disturbance data. Can you remind us, is that link that I put in there, the landfire.gov participate ref data, is that the place to go to learn more about how to submit data? Okay.
Yep. Participate's a great place to go and learn about what has been contributed. You know, when we talk about this, and maybe while Inga's getting set up here, you can also verify and validate, hey, I sent that in. What happened to those LANDFIRE thieves? Did they use it or not? And so you're able to go in. We've got some updated spreadsheets that you can look at and say, oh, yep, it looks like it's on the list. Key thing that you don't have in that spreadsheet is where is it in the process on that production conveyor belt. We don't share that much detail and information that might be helpful, but just know that if it's on the list, it's there and we will be using it. But that's the right place to start.
Okay, great. All right, we can see your slideshow, Inga. You're ready to go.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to give an overview of the specific details of the products that the 2019 limited update will bring. So first I wanted to put this update into context with some of the updates that you might be used to. So our previous updates, for example, 2012 and 2014, those were based on, the vegetation that was mapped there was based on imagery from our original LANDFIRE. And then any changes were applied with rule sets. For Remap, the vegetation modeling was based on imagery from circa 2016 imagery. So that was obviously a complete redo with no rule sets for change. And then now for the 2019 L, it's back to the update kind of idea. So we're still based, the vegetation modeling was based on that 2016 imagery. And then any disturbed areas will have the rule sets applied for change. And you can see a little bit more in terms of what layers that we provided with previous updates. So these are the layers that we provided for the 2012 and 2014 updates. Now, some of them were, you know, we're just different from what we have with Remap. But in general, we were able to provide existing vegetation cover, height, and type differences. And then the fuels, the fire regime just had some classes available. But really, if you look at the Remap, that's you know, that's sort of our full suite of everything that we could possibly provide, right? It's 32 spatial layers, and all but 2 of them are 30-meter resolution rasters. But if you look at these different sections, I mean, each of these is a raster layer here, and each of these is a raster layer, and all of these, and all of these. So the only ones that aren't really are the reference layers and the events geodatabase, which is a perimeters shapefile, and then the reference database, which is really just a database, but it does have some XY information for our plot data. But I think, you know, this is a good place to kind of start. Like, we do provide all of this information, the vegetation, the fuels, the disturbance, is very kind of big, broad categories. But with a 2019 limited update, we're kind of paring that down a little bit, just so that we can get what we think might be the most important things out there as quickly as possible. So vegetation cover and height, important things to know if they've changed from disturbance. The surface fuel models, all of the canopy layers, and then the fuel vegetation layers, which I'll explain a little bit more. But we're not updating the fire regime. There's only a certain amount of disturbance layers that we can deliver. We're not updating the reference stuff. But that doesn't mean we're not going to update those layers in the future. So the key to updating our vegetation and fuel layers is accounting for disturbance, right? So we need to know what areas have been disturbed in order to update those other layers. So that's sort of our first step in the process. And how do we do that? Well, there's a prioritization for where we get our disturbance information. And there's a difference between what we did for Remap and what we're doing for the limited update. The highest priority, top of the pyramid, is the fire program data. And Henry mentioned that's the monitoring trends and burn severity program that maps large fires. So 1,000 acres or more in the west and 500 acres or more in the east. And the BARC and RAVG. So those are the federal programs that are for those large fires. And so that's kind of the top of the pyramid. And then you'll see here change. So that's what we're talking about, remote sensing. That's the in-house LANDFIRE remote sensing of a landscape change. So that's what that change means. The events are, again, those submitted perimeters that Frank was talking about. I mean, very important, right? So normally, or I guess not normally, but in Remap and some of the previous updates, we had all of these different sources of information. You can see the burned area information as well was in there. But for the limited update, you can see that all the parts of this pyramid that include the word change, or I guess no change here, but if you have any kind of change, the remote sensing of landscape change, that's not going to be included in the 2019 limited update. And I think that's really our main difference between previous updates and this update, as well as Remap. So keeping that in mind, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those differences. So fire program data. Again, we find that a lot of people don't realize that we do use MTBS, BARC, and RAVG in our disturbance layer. So we do. Just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. These programs use the normalized burn ratio to look at the difference between burned vegetation and healthy vegetation in the near infrared and the shortwave infrared parts of the spectrum. And by doing that, you can see by the, by the amplitude, by the magnitude of the difference, you can get an idea of the severity within those fires. And we use that information as well in our disturbance. We did do what, one of the processes we normally do for the fire program data is a focal fill, where if there is missing data, we kind of use the pixels around it and fill in that missing data. So here's the other major kind of input into the 2019 limited disturbance, and that's those events. And so these are submitted by federal, state, municipal, nonprofit, all kinds of folks that submit these events. And on the left, you can see that the year 2016, it didn't have a whole lot of events really going on. I mean, it was a little bit of a sparse year compared to 2017, and the 2017 events will be included in the 2019 limited update. You can see here that there's some kind of big polygons in the lake states in the Northeast, and those are all insect. So this is like the emerald ash borer and gypsy moth. So those really stand out. A lot more fires in the West for 2017. But again, these are all little, submitted perimeters that we get. I want to make it clear that these 2017, 2018, 2019 events, we use them to affect change in vegetation and fuels, but we're not going to actually release those until next year. So here you can see the 2018 events, which, there's a little more action going on over here. There's some stuff in the Western Cascades, and then the 2019 events. So those, those submissions vary depending on what kind of disturbance is happening on the landscape. Probably also vary with the effort of submission as well, unfortunately. But all right, so typically, we do this remote sensing of landscape change in-house. And the advantage of doing that is that we don't really, I think we have a 50 pixel minimum mapping unit. So anything larger than that, we're going to try to pick up with our remote sensing methods. And we use a lot of similar stuff. We use the MBR like MTBS does. We use NDVI, which is very common in looking at change in greenness for vegetation. But this MICA is really our workhorse of looking at remote sensing of landscape change. And so sometimes we'll pick up stuff that people don't submit and that are maybe smaller than like the fire program would submit. So although for the 2019 limited update, this form of change detection wasn't used, we will have this next year for 2017 through 2020. So we're in the process of running through and doing this kind of remote sensing of landscape change for those years. And so I wanted to point out some of the differences that you get by not having that remote sensing. So on the left here, you have the 2016 annual disturbance. And so that was from the Remap effort. And you can see that it has all these kind of white speckled areas. And that's directly from the remote sensing of landscape change process that LANDFIRE does. They're considered unknown disturbances, but they do have a level of severity associated with them, okay? And then if you look over here at the 2017 year of limited annual disturbance for our release now, you can see that we don't have that. And it's because we didn't use that remote sensing of landscape change. But that doesn't mean there's not a lot of information in here. If you look at South Florida, big fire year, right? And so those events were all submitted. You can see there's some insect damage. Frank, do you want to tell people what this blank spot is?
It's the Mississippi Delta, river valley.
Yeah. Yeah, we were looking at that yesterday. So it's just
it really
interesting.
stands out as the lack of disturbance.
Right. So, you know, the thought is that a lot of this is mechanical removal in the southeast. The timber is quite popular there. And that's not something that would necessarily get reported to us, right? But we can still pick it up with the remote sensing. So again, these will not be released on their own, but in a minute, I'll talk to you about how they were incorporated into the fuel disturbance layer. Okay, so for the Northwest, again, we can see some of that white unknown from the remote sensing of change from 2016. And you don't really see any white, you don't see any white over here because it's all events and fire program data. However, look at all those events, right? So there's a lot going on. I mean, somebody went crazy mapping the Swiss needle cast from Doug fir fungus here in the Western Cascades. So that was a lot of effort involved in that. So
Inga, what does biological mean? The first one on the top.
I think there's people people define things differently, right? So I kind of lump that in with insects, but it could be, again, it could be either disease or probably Brenda knows the answer to that. So
I think Brenda's on. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm on. Biological means biological control of invasive. So they might be releasing insects to help control invasive plants and stuff like that. So.
Okay, great. I'm glad that we could clear that up. Awesome. Yeah. So even without that remote sensing of disturbance process, we still captured quite a bit here for the Northwest in 2018, for example. For the Southwest in 2019, you can see that, with just kind of glancing between the two, it looks like we didn't really miss much, right? In terms of the method of recording disturbance here. And it even looks like there's probably more events here more disturbance here than there was in using the remotely sensed method as well. But if you kind of check out this area, it's got a little crook here. So I'm gonna zoom in on that area, and you can see that there is some probably some harvest that we're missing in the 2019 limited update that before the remote sensing picked up on. So just keeping that in mind when you're working with the limited update here. So what do we do with these annual disturbance layers? Well, we use them to account for change in vegetation and fuels. And one way to do that is to sort of categorize those disturbances by how long it has been since the disturbance happened. And so this helps us account for the effect of the disturbance, but also any kind of regrowth that has happened since. And so we can do that with our fuel disturbance layer. And so what we do is kind of smush all of that together, all of those different years together, for example, over a 10-year period. And we put them into categories. So if we're looking at the 2019 LFDIST, you can see that these different years of disturbance were put into a time-sense disturbance category. All right. Now, you see up here it's saying 2021 capable. Well, what is capable? Well, capable means that the year listed, so 2021 in this case, represents the vegetation and fuels at the beginning of that season. So, for example, right now, right? So if a disturbance happened in 2019, it has been 2 years time since the disturbance happened. And so it gets placed in this 2 to 5 year time since disturbance category. And that category is going to be used in all of our transition rules, right? Because we want our vegetation to represent kind of the most recent state. And so the FDIS actually shows only the most recent disturbance for a pixel. with these codes, all right? So it's only going to tell you, you know, if something happened in 2015 and 2019, it's only going to show you that value of 2 for the time sense disturbance, because that's the most recent. So that's really, you know, honestly, this process of counting back in time is one of the most difficult things I have to do quite often, because I'm like always counting on my fingers and everything like that. So this is a little confusing. So if we need to come back to this, I completely understand. Now, the 2019 LFDIS is 2021 capable, and the Remap FDIS was 2020 capable. So we're kind of moving ahead a year. And it has been released with the 2029 limited update. So that's where you're going to find those limited disturbances in that 2 to 5 year category. All right, so they'll be accounted for there. All right, and so here this is just an example of the 2020 capable FDIS versus the 2021 capable FDIS. Now, because it has some of those older years of disturbance, it's going to pick up, it's going to still represent some of that remote sensing disturbance in the Southeast, for example. So, you know, one thing that really popped out at me here was the addition of all of the insects and disease up in here, the blues, right? So that seems to be kind of a difference between those two. All right, so how do we use this FDIS layer in changing vegetation and fuels? So we used these vegetation transition rule sets. And these were developed by the University of Idaho and Wendell Hahn, and they're based on vegetation transition rules from previous updates. So kind of just translated them to kind of the Remap era codes. And they are rule sets that change existing vegetation cover and height. And you need to have the disturbance type, the severity, and the time sense disturbance in order to apply the rule set. It does account for a time sense disturbance with some amount of regrowth of vegetation, depending on, you know, what kind of vegetation it is. And then we only used it in disturbed areas and only for the time sense disturbance category of 2, right? Because Remap basically accounted for a lot of that disturbance when we used that 2016 imagery. So the areas that are undisturbed from 2017 to 2019 are identical to the Remap vegetation classes, all right, cover and height. So just keep that in mind. Anything before 2017 is going to be the same in our vegetation layers. We used STSIM from SynchroSim to apply the rule sets to the spatial layers. This is state, you know, it's specifically designed for state and transition rule sets in order to change the cover and height. Our EVT didn't change with the rule sets. And so down here, you'll find an example of how this works, right? So here we have the disturbance type would be fire. The severity is high. The time sense disturbance is 2 to 5 years. And then we have a certain EVT that we're looking at. In this case, the EVH, the height before the disturbance is all the same, but the cover is varying, right? So the before cover is varying. And so given all of this here, then we have a rule set that says, okay, well, the height's going to go from 10 to 25 meters to 5 to 10. You know, cover is going to stay about the same, okay? And so, you know, that just varies depending on what you're starting out with, okay? And so you can imagine how many rules we end up with. You know, these are all the same here, right? But we have all different disturbance types. We have 3 severities. We have, you know, the 3 time sense disturbance. We have, I don't know, you know, 700 EVTs. So you can just imagine that it's just I mean, I'm sure Wendell knows how many rule sets there are, but it's a lot. So anyways, the STSIM really helped, just be able to apply those rule sets to each geo area. And so here's kind of an example of that Karen Callahan sent me for how that happens. So there's some pre-processing in R that kind of sets up all of our layers, pulls in the transition rule sets in order to work with STSIM. Then we run STSIM, and then again, it's used only for the new areas of disturbance. And then our outputs are change in EVC and EVH in those disturbed areas. So for vegetation, we used the FDIST, right? But we only used that category 2, all right, to apply the transition. So the 2 to 5 year time sense disturbance category. And so this is showing you the 2019 L capable, the 2021 capable FDIST. So that's everything, which I showed you before. And then this is the 2 to 5 year only. So you can see the difference there. So we just don't have the older, the 6 to 10 class there. Vegetation type, I mean, this is kind of a giveaway slide. We're not changing anything for vegetation type, okay? So only cover and height. So we're not really re-releasing vegetation type from Remap. It's going to be the same. So for vegetation cover, just an example. So the rule sets are applied to the disturbed areas, and we're focusing on the areas of change. So in the Northeast, for example, you can see here where the red pixels lost cover and the green gained some cover, all right? And that, again, that depends on all those starting conditions, the severity, what kind of, is it grassland or, what is it? Because some of that stuff bounces back pretty quick. Let's see. Yeah. So here's another example that Randy Swati provided in his neck of the woods up in the Upper Peninsula. So this is Remap EVC, right? So the vegetation cover across the landscape. And then when we see the vegetation transition rules in action, we get our 2019 L EVC. So, so over here, the Remap beforehand, there was a harvest event, and you can see that cover was reduced there. So we're accounting for that in 2019 now. Same goes for vegetation height. So here in the South Central, we get kind of repeated prescribed fires in the Flint Hills, and that's showing a reduced vegetation height in the 2019 L coverage. So yeah, so that's vegetation cover and height for 2019 L. All right, so moving on to fuels. We have the surface fuel rules for 2019 L for disturbed areas. And these rules are essentially the same as what was used for Remap disturbed areas. And they were developed and calibrated with local fire managers. They're actually based on pre-disturbance fuels. And when we talk about pre-disturbance fuels, that means what was there before the disturbance. So that's what we call our fuel vegetation type, our fuel vegetation cover, our fuel vegetation height, okay? So if you look at those layers, you're looking at a combination of what's there now in undisturbed areas and what was there before a disturbance happened, okay? So all of these rules can be found in the latest version of the LANDFIRE Total Fuels Change tool and the associated database. Okay, and that's kind of what I'm showing here is the database that's associated with the tool. It uses the same FDIST, okay, but it uses both the 2 to 5 year and the 6 to 10 year categories to apply the transitions. And that's because of the fact that it's using pre-disturbance fuels, right? So if you look here, my favorite area, I know the fuels team makes fun of me for always looking at pitch pine, but that's okay. So you can see here we have the pitch pine barrens, no disturbance here. And, you know, if you have pretty much any cover, but 2 different height ranges, then you're going to have a shrub 9 for the low stuff and shrub 8 for the taller trees. That's in a regular, you know, non-disturbed area. If you go to a moderately, you know, severe fire disturbance, then that is going to change your fuel model from an SH9 in the low to an SH8, and from an SH8 to an SH4 in the higher trees. So you can see how those things will shift to different, and in this case, you know, a less intense fuel model after a disturbance. So here you have the Scottenbergen 40, which is shown here, the surface fuel model. So we have all of these, you know, I don't even know if I have them all listed here, but all of these different fuel models that essentially describe what the rate of spread is going to be and what the flame lengths are going to be for these different types of fuels. Okay, so very important information. And then I've focused here on Long Island, which I thought would be different than what most people are used to. But in any case, there was an insect event here. So here's the Remap fuel models, and then here you can see the 2019 L has been adjusted for the fuel model. And so it went from a SH8 to a SH6, so a less intense fuel model, where that, I believe it was gypsy moth. I would have to double check on that. But anyway, so you can see the differences there. And this was a fire that happened before. So that was already accounted for in Remap. So you can see, very important to have those disturbances in there. Canopy fuels, a whole another kind of set of information that's also needed for fire behavior modeling. So the methods for canopy fuels, again, are the same as what we did for Remap for disturbed areas. Again, based on that pre-disturbance fuel information, and using FDIS, uses the same FDIS categories as vegetation, but more. And then, you know, I guess it's important to know that our disturbed area canopy cover, canopy height, canopy base height, those are derived via linear equations from FBS outputs. And then our canopy bulk density is calculated using a general linear model with FET, canopy cover, and canopy height as inputs. So, so that's all pretty much the same as how we did it for Remap. So just keep that in mind. All of these layers are going to be released with or have been released with 2019 L update. And so here we're going back to Randy's area, and you can see with that harvest that the canopy bulk density is pretty much gone, right? Because there's no trees left. But then for other areas where you know, maybe the disturbance is more than 10 years old, we're pulling in information for those areas, filling those back in. Okay, so why are all these changes to vegetation and fuels important? Why do we need to keep up with this stuff? Okay, and that has to do with a lot of the different applications of LANDFIRE in general. And so one of which is these landscape level hazard models. So FSIM is one of them. And they pull in what we call landscape files from LANDFIRE. And that includes all of the fuels, some of the topography, and so all of these different layers from LANDFIRE in order to run the model. So when you run the model, you get an idea of burn probability. you also get an idea of flame length. And so that basically, you multiply those together and you get an idea of what is the hazard, what are, how hazardous are these fuels in this landscape. And so that feeds into these larger wildfire risk assessments, okay? So we've got the probability, we've got the intensity, and then once we have that, we can see how is that affecting things like highly valued resources and assets, and like homes, businesses, all of those things. So and then when you combine the two, then you get an idea of what is the actual risk of fire on this landscape. And the same ideas are used in IFTDIS with the landscape burn probability and the qualitative wildfire risk assessments. So LANDFIRE directly, feeds into a lot of these types of risk assessments that you see. And the risk assessments, I think, a lot of times are used for prioritizing, like where do we need to treat our fuels? Where do we need to focus our resources? And then, you have your FLAM map and your FAR site, kind of more operational fire behavior models that also use our landscape files. So all of the fuels information that comes with that. So here is an example of a Spring Hill fire in New Jersey from 2019. And, we were trying out different fuel models and to see which worked best for that area. So here's the Shrub 9 run here, which actually worked really well. Okay, so where's LANDFIRE headed? Well, Henry talked about this a little bit. So we are, the 2019 limited update is ready. It's out now. Again, the events and fire program data for the disturbance for 2017 through 2019, and then vegetation and fuels changed in disturbed areas. 1 year from now, target, right, is the addition of the remote sensing for 2017 through 2020. And those disturbance layers will essentially replace the limited disturbance information. So it'll be it's like limited plus with more detailed disturbance. And then we also will have the added year of 2020. So again, our goal is to decrease the latency and increase the frequency of our products, include fewer years of disturbance with each release as we work towards the actual annual update that Henry was talking about. We do also want to try to move a little away from rule sets and towards imagery-based updates for vegetation and fuels. So we don't have to deal with those millions of rules. But there's other ideas in play as well. So this is just showing you kind of the disturbance side of things. So this is for our target for next year is to have all of that remote sensing based disturbance plus the events plus the fire program data and all of our different sources for 2017 through 2020 next year, right? And then the year after, it would only be 2 years of disturbance data that we need to process. And then the year after that, it would only be the 1 year. So that's kind of, we're trying to kind of squish that down. But again, targets, we're going to do our best, I think. And I just want to thank everybody that helped me, especially Randy and Karen, who provided some great graphics in the nick of time. So now do we ask for questions or are we going to keep going?
I think it might be good to pause and ask for questions while Randy is pulling up his talk. Okay. So in order for him to do that, you have to stop sharing. So now, like I said in the beginning, we made this a meeting so folks would feel comfortable asking their question. Just unmute yourself. And yeah, I'm curious if this sparked any questions. Surely if there's one question out there, more people have the same question. So,
or if anyone from the LANDFIRE team has clarifications.
have a question for Henry. A lot of our users get the LANDFIRE data through the WFDIS wildfire decision support tool, or through the Fuels decision support tool, IFTDIS. Do we know when this new 2019 L will be available on those platforms?
Oh, great question. We've been in conversations with the Wildland Fire Decision Support System. They're currently working on getting, and maybe I'll just say this, is we're doing a little bit of a pre-release for a few areas for the LANDFIRE 2016 Remap products for Alaska, knowing that, hey, they need them now. They don't need them in September or October when we might eventually get those things posted and available. So they're currently working on that. And then as soon as that is completed, we're going to be looking at how do we update their data for the 2019 L products, because that's in process actually probably as we're speaking right now with the 2016 Remap. For IFTDIS, IFTDIS does not currently have that available, and our conversations with the IFTDIS team, this actually ties to some chats, I guess, that I've chatted with a few folks here, relative to the part earlier about, hey, how can I participate and provide data to LANDFIRE? You saw in the chat that I said we also do services. And so if there's something that, folks would like to, connect with us via services, we definitely would like and welcome that. And so what IFTDIS, the Interagency Fuel Treatment Decision Support System, is looking at doing is tapping into the LANDFIRE products service, because that's in process of being built. We've got a number of services available, but IFTDIS feels like instead of the model that we've been under, take the data, host it locally, and continually try to stay up to date with all of the versions, it's not a good model to be in. And so from a fuels planning perspective, most of the fuels, I'll say general planning work, has been completed, and folks are really focused on what we're doing now, PL4, our preparedness level. So folks are really focused more on that. And so IFTDIS has said, let's wait. Let's let the LANDFIRE product service get to a point where these data can be provided, and then we will just automatically connect, to the latest and greatest LANDFIRE products. So that's where IFTDIS is going. Great question, though.
Any other questions before Randy gets started?
Hi, yes, I have a question. I use IFTDIS quite a bit, and I work on the Tahoe National Forest. And I noticed I was using the 2014 LANDFIRE data for the past several years, and then 2016 just came out. And I'm noticing that it's not quite, it seems like the 2014 is, the fuel models are better and more accurate than the 2016. Is there anything I can help you guys with when I'm out in the field looking around, or how is that, how do they collect the LANDFIRE data? Is it just a satellite kind of looking at things, and then it's up to us to go out and really look at it and give feedback?
So great questions, Linda. There'll probably be a bunch of people that would like to jump in on this one, but at least I'll start. So yes, if you're seeing things relative to the various versions, because I highlighted some of that, Inga went into some more of the details. We are very interested in feedback on those products. In fact, under that participate link that you see in the chat, there is also information there under that website that's you can link to. Give us feedback. We're interested in that. And so types of feedback, we're really focused on, of course, those larger landscape items that you are seeing. It's difficult when people send us, the my favorite pixel kind of stuff, because we're dealing with so many pixels that it's difficult to focus just on that, area. But if you've got larger landscape issues that you're seeing, please send us, of course, the specific locations of where you're seeing that, and then to the extent you can, we'd like, if you've got data to help support what you're talking about, send that. If you don't have that, even just detailed comments about, okay, when I say better, this is what I mean. It's one thing when we hear the word better, because, sometimes that's all relative. But if you can get specific to say, hey, in this vegetation type, the fire behavior fuel model is X in 2014, and in LANDFIRE 2016, LANDFIRE called it fire behavior fuel model Y. And the differences with that is we look at, like flame lengths, rates of spread, they just don't play out well for my location. If you can get into more of those details, that will help us. So I think I'll stop there. And then I know Charlie was on, so maybe let's, look to Charlie Martin or Tobin Smale. They're part of the fuels team, and they could, comment on that. And then I see some other hands.
Yeah, I'll comment on that, Henry. As far as that Tahoe area goes, we originally set those field models according to the specialists in that area, in that particular area. That's how those field models got set. The field models for Remap 16 or Remap did not change. The rule sets are the same. So the two sets of field models should be pretty much the same if the vegetation hasn't changed. So, we'd have to investigate a little bit to make sure about that, but I would suspect there was probably a change in the EVT for some of those areas that she's looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Kendra, feel free to chime in. And Charlie, is it okay if we put your email in the chat window so folks, or so she can email you with more questions?
Certainly, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Kendra, feel free to chime in.
Oh, hi. So quick question. I think it's pretty awesome that the NDVR and the NDVI imagery will be provided on here. Just because I as kind of a hydro type, I'm a little bit more sensitive to the impacts to the soil. So is there, will the availability of the soil burn severity maps ever be integrated into LANDFIRE? Will that continue to be housed in the USGS portal? Either way is fine. It was just more of a one-stop shopping curiosity.
Can you clarify, Kendra, when you say USGS severity, are you talking about like monitoring trends in burn severity?
Yeah,
like the BARC RAVG, or
yeah. So yeah, it looks like they've definitely expanded on the amount of data that they're housing in there. And so I know that the BEAR teams are starting to put the soil burn severity imagery in there as well. And so I guess I was just wondering with the transfer of the RAVG and the vegetation burn severity, if there would ever be if LANDFIRE would provide to be a portal for the soil burn severity when that is made available as well.
Great question. Of course, others feel free to chime in. So LANDFIRE currently uses, as Inga talked about, and I don't know what time you joined, if you were at the beginning or not, but LANDFIRE currently uses monitoring trends and burn severity information. BARC RAVG are also, part of that.
Yeah.
And that severity information is crucial to helping us with that remote sensing change detection, part of what level of change. But the soils part that you're alluding to, I would say the answer to that is no, we have not, gone into those level of details, and that's probably some area that we need to, dig into that and look at that a little bit closer.
Oh, Henry, you said dig into soils.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Right.
All right, thank you very much.
I'm going to read a question on the chat from Tom Thompson. Is there any plan to use GEDI, Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation data to help inform LANDFIRE products?
Yeah, I did put a little reply in there. So we're definitely looking into incorporating GEDI data in the future for modeling our structure data. So, but we're mainly looking at it relation to our efforts in the cloud right now and trying to, because LiDAR is just so data intensive, no matter how you look at it. So, so that's kind of our focus right now.
Great. Patrick, feel free to ask your question. You're muted, so maybe I caught him grabbing a cup of coffee. While we're waiting for Patrick, oh, there he is.
Yeah, actually, I just had a package come to the front door.
Oh, okay, go for it.
I was running to grab it. Linda, this is kind of in regards to your question about the landscape. In the spring of 2020, we had a LANDFIRE Fuels calibration workshop, and that was one of the pieces that we're trying to do to try to help improve on that component of like having on the ground input to those LANDFIRE fuels calibration. So and provide help in those rule sets. So one of the things is we Pyrologix has completed that first set, but then we had the 2020 fire season come in. Really dramatically changed things as we saw. But one of the things is you have access to that data set. I can also share that out. It's available. But they are going through, I think they just about finished up with 2021, and they're starting with a fire modeling of the 2021 for the hazard assessment. But just for the landscape, for the calibrated version that they have, just this is tied to the all lands hazard assessment, which hopefully is going to, we'll be able to connect, and it'll feed into this 2022 version. And correct me if I'm wrong, Henry or Frank, on that. The 2022 for our area in the state. So.
Yeah, Patrick's right. So I guess, Patrick's being kind of modest, just so folks know, he serves on the LANDFIRE advisory group. So we are in quite frequent conversations with Patrick and, of course, a few others, and coordinating on items, exactly what Patrick mentioned. So thanks, Patrick.
And if you have any, and if you have any questions, I can put my my phone number and my email in there too. So you can just reach out and chat with me if you want to. Offline.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Patrick.
Right.
Melissa asked a question: in using the MTBS data, how do you address the criticism made for the breakpoints for eastern fires? Melissa, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to expand on that a little bit. But
do you mean the severity breakpoints, Melissa?
Yeah, I was talking about the severity breakpoints and the fact that eastern fires often happen leaf off. So, what are we really looking at when those change, those differences seen?
Well, I think we just take it as is right now, but I'd be interested in figuring out if there's something that we could do to address that. For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I just bring it up as a researcher. I tried to use that data and got reviewer two'd pretty badly that it wasn't for that purpose. So, but yeah, I know we need more plot data to verify our severity classes here in the East. Something changed. Obviously, reflectance changed, so something happened, but what does it actually mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good question, Melissa, and Inga's right. We do take it just as is, and I would say we do not solely just rely, as much as MTBS, BARC, RAVG. They're really, really important because they're more thorough, I will say, even though we're talking about a lack of thoroughness with the issue you're highlighting. They are definitely more thorough than some, and per the things that Inga covered earlier, LANDFIRE also does, that remote sensing landscape change process down to roughly that 10-acre threshold. And so we're capturing, again, some change to the degree that some severity can be assessed there. but it's not as robust or thorough as MTBS BARC RAVG is for sure. So we're trying to help fill in some of the gaps. When I saw your question, I was thinking of the breakpoint between 500 acres, 1,000 acres. But thank you for clarifying.
Sure. Thanks.
Brian, do you have anything to add to that? Sir.
I think I was trying to, I mean, the way they work is they try to find the first image prior before the disturbance occurs or the fire occurs, and then the next one after. So it's always possible that they would wait to do an extended assessment. So if it happened during leaf off, they might look at it during using leaf on imagery, a prior leaf on imagery, and then a post leaf or after burn when there should be leaf on. And then that's how they probably assign assessments. That would be that would be what I would think that they'd be doing in those particular cases, because you're right, it'd be very difficult to find imagery and be able to do a similar severity type of analysis without some sort of vegetation component or a leaf on component. So yeah, but Henry's right. They look at every fire and it's hand mapped. So in theory, those are supposed to be the best of what's possible. And if we do have a disturbance and we pick it up with our remote sensing, MTBS, BARC RAVG will always override our data. So that will always be replacing. So if it's coincident, we don't, ours goes out the door.
Great. Maybe we should move on to Randy, and then we'll
before
have
we
another
do that,
question.
Megan, let's go to Melanie's question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. In the chat, she posted, am I correct in understanding that vegetation type, EVT, and of course EVT is connected with either ecological systems or the National Vegetation Classification Standard, are only updated with the Remap? And then she goes on and says, are there any plans to update vegetation type more frequently than 10 years? So the answer to that question is no, that's not correct. For 2019L, yes, we just kept it the same based on the limited nature of the product. But in updates, there will be changes to EVT, particularly as we start to bring in the remote sensing component. So there will be changes to that in future updates, and you'll be able to see that as we move into the scheduled updates that I touched on, and Inga went into a little bit more detail.
Great. We'll have some time after Randy's done to address any other questions. So go for it, Randy.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for sticking with us during this presentation. We really, really appreciate your being here, your questions, comments, and feedback. Also, I wanted to thank Henry, Frank, and Inga for the great information they provided. And a special shout out to the LANDFIRE production team. This map you're looking at here on the screen has over 9 billion 30 meter by 30 meter pixels that the LANDFIRE production team labeled with an existing vegetation type. There are dozens of data sets where they've done this mammoth task of labeling over 9 billion pixels, and that's just for the lower 48. So they're toiling away. They don't get the credit that they deserve. I feel oftentimes they're not here. I'm talking about what they do, so I wanted to shout out to them. I'm on the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE team, and we're lucky enough to have an agreement with the LANDFIRE program to help users use the data. So if somebody calls me and says, I want to do a fire needs assessment for Wisconsin, how do I use LANDFIRE data? That's where I jump in. Or somebody says, I'm starting to work in this national forest and we're getting ready for a plan revision. How would I use LANDFIRE data to get at some of the parts of the 2012 planning rule? That's where we jump in. But yeah, special shout out to the LANDFIRE production team. I'm going to do something maybe a little bit strange today and talk about things that were not updated as part of the 2019 limited update. All right, so Henry and Inga detail LANDFIRE's 2019 limited update. I wanted to go over a few data sets that were updated in the 2016 remap, but not in the 2019 limited update. I'll focus on the data products found in the fire regime group part of the website and of the data products download. I encourage you to go to landfire.gov and explore it for yourself. If you click on that fire regime button there, many of you probably already know this, but you'll get the data sets that are in this group and their descriptions. So more specifically, I wanted to talk about the biophysical settings or BPS models, descriptions, and spatial data. The historical fire regime data, which is now an attribute of the biophysical settings or BPS spatial data. The succession class data, or S-class as we refer to it, is built on updated rules and input data. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what succession classes are and what this means more specifically. Vegetation departure index and condition class are all linked to those aforementioned products. So I'll talk just a little bit about that as well. So biophysical settings, just a refresher for you all, represents the dominant vegetation systems just prior to European colonization. So the biophysical settings is like a trio. We have the models, which are used to kind of document and collect all of our information on disturbance regimes and to model the historical amounts of the succession classes or several states of each biophysical setting. We have a description that's delivered as a Word document, and we have the spatial data that you see here. Over a couple, 3 years actually, we implored everyone we could to help us review the models and descriptions and legends. They were originally developed as part of LANDFIRE National, and we knew there was new science and feedback that we'd received that we wanted to incorporate. We made changes to over 300 biophysical settings as due to review from many of you and others. We had hundreds of experts help us with that. We also reviewed the legend or list of biophysical settings. We did some cleaning up of the legend, and I'll show an example of how this plays out in the actual mapping process. And I'm going to call your attention to Blankenship et al., a paper that my colleague recently lead authored with help from others. Megan will put that link in the chat for you to check out. It documents the history of the biophysical settings, models, and descriptions. Excuse me. Okay. So the descriptions, models, and associated historical fire regimes. We did several changes to the reviewed biophysical settings. The descriptions were changed, as I mentioned. So if there were new papers that we needed to insert, there were new disturbance understandings that we needed to put in the document, we did that. We changed the models. So if somebody said, you know, the surface fire regime for the northern pine oak ecosystem in Wisconsin should be 10 years, not 23 years that you had in your previous models, we would implement that. So that was super critical for us improving the products. Additionally, as I mentioned, each biophysical setting has succession classes that are the developmental stages for that particular system. We use rules to map those succession classes on the landscape today. Those rules are based on height and cover breaks largely, but also leaf form. We went through, it was sort of like that spreadsheet that Inga talked about earlier. This is a huge Excel spreadsheet that has all the rules for each biophysical setting. And so we went through and cleaned that up, applied input from experts, and made sure that there were no holes in the data set that the mappers use. Also, as I mentioned, we changed the legend. An example of how this played out was experts in Wisconsin noted that the northern pine oak ecosystem should be split into northern pine oak and northern pine oak pine dominated because they have different fire regimes, different soil characteristics, and so on. So we did that. We split that one biophysical setting up into two. Then the mappers mapped that new biophysical setting. We modeled and described it with help from the experts. So on the fourth bullet, I say the biophysical settings data was updated, but maybe not in the way you think. We did not do a full remap of the biophysical settings. But where there was a change in the legend or some kind of or particular bit of input we could apply, we did do that. Or I should say the LANDFIRE mappers did that. This map depicts some of the implications of the changes. In Wisconsin, these light green areas show where the historical fire regime was bumped up like 2 to 5 years, a fire return interval that is, 2 to 5 years between LANDFIRE National and the reviewed model set. And then the orange and red areas show where the fire return interval was decreased. And those deep decreases were much bigger than any increase we saw. So when you go to map historical fire in Wisconsin, there's a lot more than we had originally mapped. I haven't calculated the acres, but it's a lot more now in terms of annual acres that would have burned historically based on the reviewed data. So thanks to all the reviewers that helped us with this. I think the products are much better. As I mentioned, vegetation departure changed as well because it's sort of a mashup of all the inputs that I mentioned before. It compares modeled amounts of succession classes for the historical or reference period to what we map on the landscape today. It's impacted by changes in the biophysical settings models and spatial data and the succession class rules and that new data. So because we have tons of review, a lot of QA, QC, and updates to the inputs, I encourage you to download and use this version of the data sets. Again, that's the 2016 remap. Okay, so running through this, I look forward to a conversation with you if you're at all confused about anything here. I wanted to summarize things for you in this last slide. The first bullet reminds you of what I'm talking about when I say fire regime data sets or products. These products were updated as part of the remap in 2016, but were not included in the 2019 limited update. And I would say that all the products in the fire regime group of products were changed during the remap because of user input. And I have a couple email addresses below, so you can obviously ask us questions now or email us at these two links below, and we'll get back to you as fast as we can with relevant information. Thanks, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Thanks, Randy. So we still have some time for questions that didn't get answered in the first round of Q&A, so please don't be shy. Feel free to unmute yourself and get any clarification you need. I see Chuck, you just unmuted yourself. I'm going to go ahead and launch our evaluation poll, so feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I had a question about the BPS layer, because now you've rolled in the MFRI rather than just delivering that as a single standalone layer, right?
Yes, that's true. So the historical fire regime attributes are now folded into the biophysical settings data set. Henry or Frank, are you guys planning on delivering separate fire regime data sets, or will they continue to be rolled into the biophysical settings data?
So plan is that we've got still a body of work to do for Alaska. That Randy didn't go into those details, but for our friends in Alaska, we're going to be doing a review over this winter. So once that is completed and we're able to look at, all lands, all products, we'll then probably roll those out separately. But we'll have to see, how things progress, because we need to get that data updated first before we can, make any final decisions.
Thanks, Henry. Great. Makes sense.
What do you think, Chuck?
Go ahead, Frank.
Do you think a separate layer would be useful, or do you think having them as attributes is simple enough to pull them out as part of the BPS?
No, it's simple enough. I just, working with the data, like for how I like to use it in the past is try to show a range of potential area burn pre-settlement, right? So now you're reporting just a single, the all fire return interval based on the database and the percent severity classes, right? The MFRI is using that database with the BPS models. So what I'm wondering about is presenting a range of data, just not the mean fire return intervals, so that you could say a range of low to high in addition to that. So what I'm wondering about is trying to link that back to a set of fire return interval work done through the FEIS group, that had it by BPS, and trying to link those together to offer a range of area burn by vegetation types. So maybe this is too much methodology into the weeds question kind of thing.
Yeah, it's good to know how folks are using the data, so that it's easy enough for us to produce it as separate, or have AOGL do it or something like that. But it's interesting to know how folks are using it, and that helps us know how best to present it.
And Chuck,
Right.
tell us where you're at and what you do besides fly airplanes.
I'm at home in my room. No. I work at the Fire Sciences Lab in Missoula, Montana, and I'm the project manager for the FLAMAP model. So I'm responsible for the care and feeding of that. And I've done a lot of work in the past using the previous products to come up with representations of area burned. And just so you guys know, the Custer National Forest, Custer Gallatin, as part of their forest plan revision, they took some work where I used the previous fire return interval stuff and fire regime groups to come up with an allowable, what I call an AFQ, an allowable fire quantity across the forest. So they're trying to in their revision, they've tried to get a fire management objective across every acre of their forest, whether that's unplanned natural ignitions or management ignited fire. And they used that work to kind of bracket what range of acres occurred historically on their forest and what type of amount of acres they're shooting for into the future as part of their forest plan revision. And so that's one use of your products, to try to look at that. And at the time, go ahead.
I was just going to say extra credit. I mean, we get an application and a great question. And Chuck, I'm definitely not too much in the weeds. I would love to talk to you more, but for everybody here, I think, we should work to get ranges in there. I see where you're coming from, Chuck. And oftentimes what we will do is we will take the fire probabilities, multiply those times the acres of each biophysical setting to get the amount that would be burned annually. And I'm guessing, Chuck, that's similar to what you did to get these allowable quantities of fire for the national forest you've mentioned. But that clever approach, I think that sounds really neat. I appreciate you mentioning that national forest.
Yeah, you can't, like in the previous versions, you would, in your table, you'd have a range of years, right? So
yeah,
it wasn't really representative of a real range, but you broke it into groups of like 5 to 10, 10 to 20. And I took those and applied those as burn probabilities and calculated the acres of burning by those classes, linked back to EVT types to try to come up with a range of acres burned by vegetation type, let's say. You can't, the way your database, your Word docs for your BPS models are right now, you can't really do it I don't think you can really do it that way anymore because of how you're calculating and reporting to all fire type MFRI value, which is what you're including in your BPS layer now, right? If I'm interpreting it right.
Yep. Great point. Well, I'd love to talk to you more, Chuck, about this and others. I don't mean to exclude you. If you would like to be on a small Zoom or something like that with us to explore these concepts, drop us an email. We'd love to have another Zoom where we discuss this, and it could be as many of you as you like. We can dig into some details together.
Thanks, Randy. Patrick, did you want to chime in? Anybody else?
Yeah, I was actually, it'll probably save me time than writing it all out. But this kind of ties right in with Chuck's question too, with that bookending of instead of the mean interval, but just the minimum and max for fire frequency. So I work with a number of the ecologists here in the region for the Forest Service, and I was just wondering if Hugh Safford from the U.S. Forest Service had reached out to you with his their FRID data or fire regime interval departure data, because it does tie right into that biophysical setting. And in the past, there has been questions that were brought up, the differences between the way that they had put together their biophysical settings as they update it, for the community wildfire, community California wildfire wildlife habitat, associations. They keep updating that, and one of the things is that's one of the products that they make is this FRID data layer, and there has been some differences between it and the LANDFIRE layer, and I was wondering if you guys had ever discussed or shared information or processes.
Yeah, I have a colleague, Corey Blankenship, who's in Bend, Oregon, and I believe she's worked directly with you a fair bit over the years, so she would be the best one to know about that connection. And Hugh has been a huge contributor to just the body of science that we lean on in that region. So I can't say that I have seen that information directly, but I know our colleague Corey Blankenship has. And I'm glad you flagged it, because I would like to reach out to Corey and or Hugh to learn more myself, because Hugh is kind of the clever master of putting together local information and LANDFIRE information and kind of making them work together. So I'm sure we can learn a lot from him.
Okay. Yeah, I'll reach out to Corey a little bit on this too, and just see if they, because I know one of the questions one of the province ecologists asked me is there a way to bring this information closer to an alignment? So when they pull LANDFIRE data, that there's a degree of comfort that it's reflecting kind of the same thing that they're seeing in their FRID data that they update.
Mm-hmm. Understandable.
All right.
Yeah, with thanks, Patrick. We'd love to hear from you for sure and have that conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Randy.
Chuck, did you have something to add before we go?
Yeah, I was going to say on the FRID data on the Klamath fire, on the Natchez fire a few years back, I used that FRID data to argue for missed fire departures, how many fire intervals have been missed in that vegetation type, to argue for we use that as a discussion point. I shouldn't say argue, as a discussion point with the forest about allowing one part of the fire burn into the wilderness, because the area, due to fire suppression, had missed so many fire return intervals that it was out of ecological whack, right? So there's a local example of using that FRID data on a real fire to argue for a lighter suppression hand.
That's really good to hear. Yeah, that's really the challenge we're having right now, and in the fire side is trying to normalize that fire is part of the system and trying to communicate that, and it's a tool to be able to communicate that to the public as well and help manage it.
And you're inspiring me to think about the Eastern United States, which I would love to try that approach more in the East, because we've missed, the oak hickory ecosystems of Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana have missed 20 fire out west, but it's still a huge departure in fire regimes in the East. So I would like to learn more and see what we could do there.